Matthew Hopkins, often referred to as the Witchfinder General, a notorious figure in 17th century England, infamous for his roles in the witch hunts that swept through East Anglia during the English Civil War. Starting in the year 1644, Hopkins, with no official title or public office, appointed himself as a hunter of witches, capitalizing on the chaotic social and religious climate of the time. His methods, which included coerced confessions, led to the execution of an estimated 300 women, making him responsible for more witch trials than any individual in England before or since. Despite his brief career, which ended with his retirement in 1647 and his passing away a year later, Hopkins' legacy remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of fanaticism and persecution. Hello and welcome to the channel. Are you new here? If you are, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, thank you for returning to the party. As always, if you like what I do and would like to support the channel, links to the Patreon are in the description. And if you want to help YouTube push the video out to more people, like, comment and subscribe certainly helps push them in the right direction. Now, without further ado, please make yourself relaxed, and we may begin. Now first, I will give a brief biography of Matthew Hopkins, talk about the situation during the English Civil War, and later on we will read directly from his writings a question and answer style format that he had developed. So, let us now begin. Matthew Hopkins, whose early life remains largely undocumented, was born in Great Wenham, Suffolk County, England. He emerged as the fourth of 6 children to James Hopkins, a Puritan clergyman who served as the vicar of St. John's of Great Wenham. The Hopkins family was somewhat prominent, holding titles to lands near Framlingham Castle. The parishioners held James in high regard. Evidence from a bequest in 1619 intended to purchase Bibles for his 3 children at the time, suggesting Matthew was born after this year. By the time Matthew began his infamous career, he was probably no older than 28, and possibly as young as 25, given his birth post-1619 and his death in 1647. His father passed away in 1634, but the parish continued to reflect his influence when William Dowsing, an iconoclast working under the orders of the parliamentarian Earl of Manchester during the English Civil War, visited in 1645, he noted the absence of idolatrous monuments in the parish. Hopkins moved to Manningtree, Essex, around the early 1640s, marked the beginning of his notorious career. He invested an inheritance of 100 marks to purchase the Thorn Inn in Mistley, positioning himself as a gentleman. While Hopkins later portrayed himself as experienced in witch hunting through his writings, notably in his book The Discovery of Witches, 1647, which we will read from shortly, he claimed to have gained this knowledge without having extensively travelled. Despite suggestions of legal training from his conduct within trials, There is very little evidence supporting this, and the little evidence that does support it is somewhat circumstantial. His brother, John, became a minister in South Fambridge in 1645, but he was removed in 1646 for neglecting his duties. This further complicated the family's reputation during this chaotic period. Now, following the events of the Lancaster witch trials of 612 to 634, an important shift occurred in the treatment and perception of witchcraft in England. William Harvey, physician to King Charles I, had been tasked with examining 4 women accused during these trials, leading to a significant change in legal procedure concerning witchcraft accusations. From Harvey's involvement, there emerged a requirement for material proof of witchcraft, specifically evidence that an accused individual had formed a covenant with the devil, rather than merely committing acts of the maleficum, or malicious witchcraft. Under this new scrutiny, witches were categorized as heretics against Christianity, which was deemed their most grievous offense. This classification brought witchcraft under the umbrella of Crimean Exceptum, with continental and Roman law, and that meant that it was considered so heinous that normal legal protocols could be overridden. So effectively, if you were accused of witchcraft, you no longer had any legal rights. Since the devil would not confess, confessions had to be extracted from the accused humans themselves, often by any means necessary. Well, the witch hunts led by Hopkins and John Stern primarily took place in East Anglia, covering Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk, and Cambridgeshire, with some activities extending to Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. Their operations coincided with the English Civil War, and were concentrated in areas with strong Puritan and parliamentarian influence, which were key components of the Eastern Association from 1644 to 47. Hopkins started his career officially in the March of 1644, after overhearing a conversation reportedly about demonic dealings in the nearby hamlet of Manningtree. Although the initial accusations were made by Stern, Hopkins quickly became involved as his assistant. Their first major trial took place in Chelmsford in 1645, where 23 women were tried. 19 were convicted and hanged, while another 4 died in prison. Do note that not a single one of them was found innocent. Now, it is important to note as well that during this period, and outside Middlesex and chartered towns, there are no records of anyone being sentenced to death for witchcraft other than by assize judges. Hopkins and Stern, along with women who performed the pricking test, travelled across England and, claiming Parliament had officially commissioned them to expose and prosecute witches. Now, no doubt when I just mentioned the pricking test, a few eyebrows raised. Well, what exactly is witch pricking? You see, it stemmed from the belief that after dealings with the devil, one would receive a mark on their body that was unable to feel pain or bleed. It was kind of like a receipt or a mark that the devil had left behind to show he was there and mark his territory. Kind of like that. So, witch prickers would have this set of needles that they would poke into the skin of suspects, trying to find which one of the marks on their bodies was the old receipt from the devil. Now, one can only imagine that if the suspect had a lot of freckles or just a few little sunspots, which many people did since people worked outside back then, how long this ordeal would take. Reportedly, the witch prickers were very thorough, which led to, most of the time, it was so painful that people would simply confess. False confessions, of course. Of course, they didn't see this as torture. They just saw this as a test. Well, of course, we know nowadays that confessions under torture are not very valid. But back in those days, a confession was a confession. Of course, don't worry. The Witchfinders are the good guys. They said so, right? Well, let's continue on. You know that they received substantial payments for their services. This wasn't a charity job at all. No, this was a proper business. Indeed, capitalizing on people's fear and being called out to a village to get rid of a witch, well, of course, that had expenses. And the more the hysteria spread, the more profitable this became. Well, this all, of course, has led a lot of historians to suggest a financial gain as a motivation. It very well could be. Hopkins himself declared that his fees covered the upkeep of his company, which included 3 horses, and he charged towns 20 shillings each. The financial burden on local communities was, of course, considerable. Stowmarket was charged £23, equivalent to about £4,000 in 2021, which is, I think, around $4,500 US. My conversion maths is not so good. Plus travel expenses, of course. Now, this might not sound like too much, but you have to remember that these are small villages filled with peasants, ran by peasants, and perhaps a somewhat underqualified bishop, local priest. Of course, when you have someone come from the big city, it's very easy to trust everything they tell you, especially when it's for your own safety and for your own good. So that's what Mr. Hopkins was very good at doing. Now, the impact of their activities was profound enough that Ipswich, which is a very large city in modern times, had to levy a special tax in 1645 to cover the costs. The activities of Hopkins and his team were well known to Parliament, by the way, and as evidenced by reports and concerns raised during the Bury St. Edmunds trials in 1645. A report to Parliament highlighted suspicions that some had resorted to dubious methods to extract confessions. Of course, you get paid for how many witches you find. If you show up to the town and there's no witches there, well, I suppose you don't really get any money for that, don't you? So it's in the best interest to make sure you get as many as you can to make the trip worthwhile. Now, the subsequent trial and executions were also met with quite a lot of discomfort and criticism, notably in an editorial from the parliamentary paper, the Moderate Intelligencer, which reflected unease with the conduct and outcomes of these witch trials. So do not think that everybody was whipped up in the frenzy. Whether it be the common people, the middle class, or even indeed the people in Parliament, there were quite a few people who were willing to ask questions about the methods and techniques, and even the whole institution of having witch hunters. Well, the techniques that Matthew Hopkins employed in his witch-hunting pursuits drew heavily from a text authored by King James I, called Demonology, and I'll have a large video on that quite soon, which Hopkins referenced in his own publication, The Discovery of the Witches. Despite torture being officially illegal in England, Hopkins engaged in coercive methods, such as sleep deprivation to force confessions from those he accused. So basically they would put you in a room and keep you up for so long whenever you'd go to doze off, they'd find some way to wake you up. Now, I get quite cranky when I haven't had my afternoon nap, so I would admit to anything just so I can get that extra 10 minutes beyond the snooze button. Additionally, he utilized a method where he would attempt to cut the arm of the accused with a blunt knife, believing that if the individual did not bleed, it indicated witchcraft. And here's another controversial method employed by Hopkins that you might know about. The swimming test, premised on the belief that witches, having renounced their baptism, would be rejected by water. The accused were tied up onto a chair and submerged in water. Floating was considered proof of witchcraft. They'd be dunked in the water and out of the water until the desired result was achieved. However, due to legal and ethical concerns, Hopkins was cautioned against using this method without the consent of the accused, leading to its official discontinuation by late 1645. Now, of course, we mentioned the consent of the accused. Now, this was one of those punishments that was, yes, very unpleasant, but if you started sinking in the water, it was pretty obvious to everybody around that you were innocent. So a lot of people simply said, "Throw me in the lake. See if I sink or swim. I'll prove you wrong." So there was perhaps a little bit of Hopkins that was saying, well, perhaps it's better that we get rid of this test, even though it could be easily rigged. Now, Hopkins and his associates also searched for the devil's mark on the body of the accused, which was purportedly an insensible spot that did not bleed or could perhaps be a mole, a birthmark, or even an extra nipple. This mark was believed to be where the witch's familiar, and that's an animal like a cat or a dog, perhaps a bird, something like that, would suckle blood from the witch, kind of like a baby nursing on its mother. In cases where no visible mark was found, the witch prickers came in, and they were employed to slowly probe the bodies with needles, often after the accused had been completely shaven to uncover any hidden marks. That includes the head and everywhere else, by the way. This very invasive procedure was part of a broader set of practices that reflected the intense witch hunt fervor of the time, all driven by this unique blend of fear, superstition, religious zealotry, and a little bit of capitalism on the side. As Hopkins' witch-hunting activities intensified, resistance began to grow, particularly from John Gall, the vicar of Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire. Gall was motivated to oppose Hopkins after caring for a woman from St. Neots who had been imprisoned on charges of witchcraft, awaiting Hopkins' examination. Upon discovering that Hopkins was inquiring about his reception in the area, Gall took action by publishing a critical work titled Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcrafts in 1646, which he dedicated to Colonel Walton of the House of Commons. Additionally, Gall embarked on a series of Sunday sermons aiming at curbing the fervor for witch hunting. So you see, this wasn't always just the full support of the church. Don't think that all of the Christians and all of that were out there trying to hunt down witches, because the people being accused, they were Christians too. And don't think that Christianity is the only one who executes people for apparent witchcraft, because that is a global phenomenon that continues into the modern day. Look at Africa, by the way. And of course, well, this man, this Gall, had certainly become the arch nemesis of Matthew Hopkins, certainly getting in the way of business, it seems. In Norfolk, the legitimacy of Hopkins and his associate John Stern's methods came under further scrutiny by the justices of the Assize. They were questioned about the ethicality of their torture techniques, and also the rather large fees that they charged for their services. Accusations were made, fingers were pointed, and they suggested that Hopkins' investigative methods might classify him and his followers as witches themselves. Pulling out the Uno reverse card on them, it seems. Questions also arose about whether Hopkins possessed undisclosed knowledge or had resorted to unlawful courses of torture in his pursuit of alleged witches. By 1647, as the judicial sessions resumed, both Hopkins and Stern had withdrawn from witch hunting, with Hopkins retiring to Manningtree and Stern to Bury St. Edmunds. This withdrawal marked a significant retreat in the face of growing legal and public opposition to their controversial methods and the ethical implications of their witch hunt practices. Well, Matthew Hopkins' influence on witch hunting extended beyond England's borders, outlined in his 1647 publication, The Discovery of Witches. His methods, detailed in this book, which we'll read from a little later, were adopted and recommended in various law books, significantly impacting witch trials in the New England colonies. The first recorded witchcraft execution in New England was Alce Young of Windsor, Connecticut, who was hanged on the 26th of May, 1647. Shortly after, Margaret Jones was tried and executed using evidence collected from techniques described by Hopkins, such as searching and watching, as noted in the journal of Governor John Winthrop. The execution of Margaret Jones, the first person to be executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts, marked the beginning of a sustained period of witch trials in New England that lasted from 1648 to 1663. And just a quick note on Margaret Jones. We actually have some case files from the trial itself. A little journal that was kept by John Winthrop, the Massachusetts governor at the time. The trial of Margaret Jones was notable for its reliance on watching, and this is what is detailed in Governor Winthrop's journal. He recorded in his journal during his vigil that he kept watching over her, an imp, kind of like a little demon, believed to be a witch's familiar, appeared in broad daylight, which was used as key evidence in her conviction. Now let's read from Winthrop's journal now. June 15th, 1648. At this court, one Margaret Jones of Charlestown was indicted and found guilty of witchcraft, and hanged for it. The evidence against her was 1. That she was found to have such a malignant touch as many persons, men, women, and children, whom she stroked or touched with any affection or displeasure or etc., were taken with deafness, vomiting, or other violent pains and sickness. 2. She practicing physic, and her medicines being such things as, by her own confession, were harmless, as anise seed, liquors, etc., yet had extraordinarily violent effects. 3. She would use to tell such as would not make use of her physic, that they would never be healed, and accordingly their diseases and hurts continued, with relapse against the ordinary course, and beyond the apprehension of all physicians and surgeons. 4. Some things which she foretold came to pass accordingly. Other things she would tell of, at secret speeches, etc., which she had no ordinary means to come to the knowledge of. 5. She had, upon search, an apparent teat, as fresh as it had been newly sucked, and after it had been scanned, upon a forced search, that was withered, and another began on the opposite side. 6. In the prison, in the clear daylight, there was seen in her arms, she sitting on the floor and her clothes up, etc., a little child, which ran from her into another room, and the officer following it, it was vanished. The like child was seen in 2 other places to which she had relation, and one maid that saw it fell sick upon it, and was cured by the said Margaret, who used means to be employed to that end. Her behaviour at the trial was very intemperate, lying notoriously, and railing upon the jury and witnesses. And in the like distemper she died. The same day and hour she was executed. There was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees, etc. End of the passage from John Winthrop's journal. Thus Margaret was executed on June 15th, 1648. Years later, some of Hopkins' interrogation and trial methods resurfaced during the infamous Salem witch trials in Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. These trials saw 19 individuals executed for witchcraft, with Giles Corey notably being pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea, and over 150 others imprisoned. Now, pressed to death, I'll quickly explain. Generally, there would be a board placed on top of you, and stones or other heavy objects would be added, slowly increasing the weight until you would be crushed. Very slowly. Not a good way to go. You end up looking like a little pancake. Now, the lasting impact of Hopkins' techniques on the American colonies highlights the profound and chilling reach of his witch-hunting legacy. He passed away at his residence in Manningtree, Essex, on the 12th of August, 1647, likely from pleural tuberculosis. He was swiftly buried within hours of his demise in the graveyard of St. Mary's Church on Mistley Heath. The legacy of Hopkins, as historian Malcolm Gaskell notes, continues to pervade that of an anti-hero and boogeyman, with his image remaining highly adaptable and eternally insubstantial. A pleasing legend regarding Hopkins' death also emerged, suggesting that he was subjected to his own infamous swimming test and executed as a witch. However, this tale is widely dispelled by the parish registry at Mistley, which confirms his actual bury there. Now, we know about the life and death. What about the works? Well, you see, we are lucky in a somewhat macabre way to have the text of the Discovery of the Witches for us all to enjoy. But before I read it, please do keep in mind that the language is a little old, and in order to remain faithful to the primary text, I'm not going to change it into a more modernized English. I think you should get the gist of it just fine. Let's take it slow. The Discovery of Witches. In answer to several queries lately delivered to the judges of Assize for the county of Norfolk, and now published by Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder, for the benefit of the whole kingdom. Exodus 22:18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Certain queries answered, which have been and are likely to be objected against Matthew Hopkins in his way of finding witches. Query 1. That he must needs to be the greatest witch, sorcerer, and wizard himself, else he could not do it. Answer. If Satan's kingdom be divided against itself, how shall it stand? Query 2. If he never went so far as is before mentioned, yet for certain he met with the devil and cheated him of his book, wherein were written all the witches' names in England, and if he looks on any witch, he can tell by her countenance what she is. So by this, his help is from the devil. Answer. If he had been too hard for the devil and got his book, it had been to his great condemnation, and no disgrace at all. And for my judgment in physiognomy, he hath no more than any man else whatsoever. Query 3. From whence proceedeth this his skill? Was it from his profound learning, or from much reading of learned authors concerning the subject? Answer. From neither of both, but from experience, which, though it may be meanly esteemed of, yet the surest and safest way to judge by. Query 4. I pray, where was this experience gained, and why gained by him, and not by others? Answer. The discoverer never travelled far from it, but in March 1644 he had some 7 or 8 of that horrible sect of witches living in the town where he lived, a town in Essex called Manningtree, with divers and other adjacent witches of other towns, who every 6 weeks in the night, always on the Friday night, had their meeting close by to his house, and had their several solemn sacrifices there offered to the devil, one of which this discoverer heard speaking to her imps one night, and bid them to go to another witch, who was thereupon apprehended and searched by women who had for many years known the devil's marks, and found to have 3 teats about her, which honest women have not. So, upon command from the justice, they were to keep her from sleep for 2 or 3 nights, expecting that in time to see her familiars, which the 4th night she called in by their several names, and told them what shapes, a quarter of an hour before they came in, there being 10 of us in the room. The first she called was 1. Holt, who came in like a white kitling. 2. Jamara, who came in like a fat spaniel without any legs at all. She said she kept him fat, for she clapped her hand on the belly, and he sucked good blood from her body. 3. Vinegar Tom, who was like a long-legged greyhound, with the head of an ox, with a long tail and broad eyes, who when this discoverer spoke to, and bade him go to the place provided for him and his angels, immediately transformed himself into the shape of a child of 4 years old, without a head, and gave 6 turns about the house, and vanished at the door. 4. Sack and sugar, like a black rabbit. 5. Newes, like a polecat. All these vanished away in a little time. Immediately after this witch confessed several other witches, from whom she had her imps, and named to divers women where their marks were, the number of their marks, and imps' names, as Elamazer, Piowacket, Peckin the Crown, Grizel, and Greedigut, which no mortal could invent. And upon their searches the same marks were found, the same number, and in the same place, and the like confessions from them of the same imps, though they knew not that we were told before, and so peached one another thereabouts, and joined together in the like damnable practice that in our 100 in Essex. 29 were condemned at once, 4 brought 25 miles to be hanged, where this discoverer lives, for sending the devil like a bear to kill him in his garden. So by seeing divers of the men's paps, and trying ways with hundreds of them, he gained this experience, and for aught he knows any man else may find them as well as he and his company, if they had the same skill and experience. Query 5. Many poor people are condemned for having a pap or teat about them, whereas many people are and have been a long time troubled with natural rets on several parts of their bodies, and other natural things as hemorrhoids, piles, childbearing, etc. And these shall be judged only by one man alone and a woman, and so accused or acquitted. Answer. The parties so judging can justify their skill to any, and shew good reasons why such marks are not merely natural, neither that they can happen by such natural cause as is before expressed, and for further answer for their private judgments alone, it is most false and untrue. For never was any man tried by search of his body, but commonly a dozen of the ablest men in the parish or elsewhere were present, and most commonly as many ancient skilful matrons and midwives present when the women are tried, which marks not only he and his company attest to be very suspicious, but all beholders, the skilfullest of them, do not approve of them, but likewise assent that such tokens cannot in their judgments proceed from any the above-mentioned causes. Query 6. It is a thing impossible for any or woman to judge rightly on such marks. They are so near to natural, and they have that they find them, durst not presently give oath that they were drawn by evil spirits, till they have used unlawful courses of torture to make them say anything for ease and quiet, as who would not do? But I would know the reasons he speaks of, how and whereby to discover the one from the other, and so be satisfied in that. Answer. The reasons in brief are three, which for the present he judges to differ from the natural marks, which are: 1. He judgeth by the unusualness of the place where he findeth the deeds in, or on their bodies being fair distant from any usual place, from whence such natural marks proceed, as if a witch plead the marks found are emerods. If I find them on the bottom of the backbone, shall I assent with him, knowing that they are not near that vein, and so others by childbearing, when it may be they are in the contrary part? 2. They are the most commonly insensible, and feel neither pin, needle, awl, etc. thrust through them. 3. The often variations and mutations of these marks into several forms confirms the matter, as if a witch hear a month or two before that the witchfinder, as they call him, is coming, they will and have put out their imps to others to suckle them, even to their own young and tender children. These upon search are found to have dry skinness and films only, and be close to the flesh, keep her 24 hours with a diligent eye, that none of her spirits come in any visible shape to suck her. The woman have seen the next day after her teats extended out to the former filling length, full of corruption, ready to burst, and leaving her alone then 1/4 of an hour, and let the women go up again, and she will have them drawn by her imps close again. Probatum est. Now for answer to their tortures in its due place. Query 7. How can it be, possibly, that the devil bring a spirit, and wants no nutriment or sustentation, should desire to suck any blood? And indeed, as he is a spirit, he cannot draw any such excrescences, having neither flesh nor bone, nor can be felt, etc. Answer. He seeks not their blood, as if he could not subsist without any nourishment, but he often repairs to them, and gets it, the more to aggravate the witch's damnation, and to put her in mind of her covenant. And, as he is a spirit and prince of the air, he appears to them in any shape whatsoever, which shape is occasioned by him through joining of condensed thickened air together, and many times doth assume shapes of many creatures, but to create anything he cannot do it. It is only proper to God. But in this case of drawing out these teats, he doth really enter into the body, real, corporeal, substantial creature, and forceth that creature, he working on it, and in it, to his desired ends, and useth the organs of that body to speak withal, to make his compact up with the witches, be the creature cat, rat, mouse, etc. Query 8. When these paps are fully discovered, yet that will not serve sufficiently to convict them, but they must be tortured and kept from sleep for 2 or 3 nights to distract them, and make them say anything, which is a way to tame a wild colt, or a hawk, etc. Answer. In the infancy of this discovery it was only not thought fitting, but enjoined in Essex and Suffolk by the magistrates, with this intention only, because they kept being awake, would more the active to call their imps in open view than sooner to their help, which oftentimes have so happened, and never or seldom did any witch ever complain in the time of their keeping for want of rest, but after they had beat their heads together in the gall. And after this use was not allowed of any of the judges and other magistrates, it was never since used, which is 1.5 years since. Neither were any kept from sleep by any order of direction since. But peradventure their own stubborn wills did not let them sleep, though tendered and offered to them. Query 9. Beside that unreasonable watching, they were extraordinarily walked till their feet were blistered, and so forced through that cruelty to confess. Answer. It was in the same beginning of this discovery, and the meaning of walking of them at the highest extent of cruelty was only then they walk about themselves the night that they were watched, only to keep them walking. And the reason was this: when they did lie or sit in a chair, if they did offer to couch down, then the watchers only desire to sit up and walk about, for indeed when they be suffered so to couch, immediately comes their familiars into the room, and scareth the watchers, and hearteneth on the witch, though, contrary to the true meaning of the same instructions, diverse had been the rustical people, they hearing them to confess to the witches, misused, spoiled, and abused, diverse whereof have suffered for the same, but could never be proved against the discoverer to have a hand in it, or consent to it, and hath likewise been unused by him and others, ever since the time they were kept from sleep. Query 10. But there hath been abominable, inhumane, and unmerciful trial of all these poor creatures, by tying them and heaving them into water, a trial not allowable by law or conscience, and I would fain know the reasons for that. Answer. It is not denied, but many were so served as had paps and floated. Others that had none were tried with them and sunk. But mark the reasons. For first, the devil's policy is great in persuading many to come for their own accord to be tried. Persuading them their marks are so close, they shall not be found out. So as divers have come 10 or 12 miles to be searched for their own accord, and hanged for their labor, as one Meggs, a baker, did, who lived within 7 miles of Norwich, and was hanged at Norwich assizes for witchcraft. Then, when they found that the devil tells them false, and they reflect on him, and he, as 40 have confessed, adviseth them to be sworn, and tells them that they shall sink and be cleared that way. Then, when they be tried that way and float, they see the devil deceives them again, and have so laid open his treacheries. 2. It was never brought in against any of them at their trials as any evidence. 3. King James in his Demonology saith, it is a certain rule, for, saith he, witches deny their baptism when they convent with the devil, water being the sole element thereof, and therefore, saith he, when they be heaved into the water refuseth to receiveth them, they being such miscreants to deny their baptism, and suffers them to float as the froath on the sea, which the water will not receive, but casts it up and down till it comes to the earthly element on the shore, and there leaves it to consume. 4. Observe these generation of witches. If they be at any time abused by being called thieves, whores, etc., by anywhere they live, they are the readiest to cry, and writhing their hands and shed tears in abundance, and run with full and right sorrowful acclamations to some justice of the peace, and with many tears make their complaints. But now behold their stupidity, nature or the elements' reflection from them, when they are accused for this horrible and damnable sin of witchcraft. They never alter or change their countenances, nor do they let one tear fall. This, by the way, swimming by able divines whom I reverence, is condemned for no way, and therefore of late hath and for ever shall be left. Query 11. Oh, but if this torturing witch-catcher can by all or any of these means wring out a word or two of confession from any of these stupefied, ignorant, unintelligible, poor, silly creatures, though none hear it but himself, he will add and put her in fear to confess telling her, else she be hanged. But if she do, he will set her at liberty, and so put a word in her mouth, and may such a silly creature confess she knows not what. Answer. He is of a better conscience, and for your better understanding of him, he doth thus uncase himself to all, and declares what confessions, though made by a witch against herself, he allows not of, and doth altogether account of no validity, or worthy of credence to be given to it, and ever did so account it, and ever likewise shall. 1. He utterly denies that confession of a witch to be of any validity, when it is drawn from her by any torture or violence whatsoever, although after watching, walking, or swimming divers have suffered, yet peradventure magistrates with much care and diligence did solely fully examine them after the sleep, and consideration sufficient. 2. He utterly denies that confession of a witch, which is drawn from her by flattery, etc. If you will confess, you shall go home. You shall not go to jail, nor be hanged, etc. 3. He utterly denies that confession of a witch, when she confesses any improbability, impossibility, as flying in the air, riding on a broom, etc. 4. He utterly denies a confession of a witch, when it is interrogated to her, and the words are put into her mouth, to be of any force or effect as to say a silly, yet which wicked enough. You have 4 imps, have you not? She answers affirmatively. Yes. Did they not suck you? Yes, saith she. Are their names so and so? Yes, saith she. Did you send such an imp to kill my child? Yes, saith she. This being all her confession after this matter, it is by him accompted nothing, and he earnestly doth desire that all magistrates and jurors would a little more than ever they did examine the witnesses about the interrogated confessions. Query 12. If all of these confessions be denied, I wonder what he will make confession, for sure it is. All these ways have been used and took for good confessions, and many have suffered for them, and I know not what he will then make confession. Answer. Yes, in brief he will declare what confession of a witch is of validity, and force his own judgment, to hang a witch. When a witch is first found with teats, then sequestered from her house, which is only to keep her old associates from her, and so by good counsel brought into a sad condition, by understanding of horribleness of her sin, and the judgments threatened against her, and knowing the devil's malice, subtle circumventions, is brought to remorse and sorrow for complying with Satan so long, and disobeying God's sacred commands, doth then desire to unfold her mind with much bitterness, and then without any of the before-mentioned hard usages or questions put to her, doth of her own accord declare what was the occasion of the devil's appearing to her, whether ignorance, pride, anger, malice was predominant over her. She doth then declare what speech they had, what likeness he was in, what voice he had, and familiars sent to her, what names they had of what number of spirits, what shapes they were in, what employment she sent them about to several persons in several places unbeknown to the hearers, all which mischiefs being proved to be done, at the same time she confessed to the same parties for the same cause, and all affected is testimony enough again for all her denial. Question 13. How can any possibly believe that the devil and the witch are joining together, should have such power, as the witches confess to kill such a man, child, horse, cow, the like, if we believe they can do what they will? Then we derogate from God's power, who for certain limits the devil and the witch, and I cannot believe they have any power at all? Answer. God suffers the devil many times to do much hurt, and the devil doth play many times the deluder and impostor with these witches, in persuading them that they are the cause of such and such a murder wrought by him with their consents, when, and indeed, neither he nor they had any hand in it. As thus, we must needs argue, he is of a long standing, above 6,000 years. Then he must needs be the best scholar in all knowledge of arts and tongues, and so have the best skills in physic, judgment in physiognomy, and knowledge of what diseases reigning or predominant in this year or that man's body. And so for cattle too, by reason of his long experience. This subtle temper, knowing such a man liable to some sudden disease, as by experience I have found, as pleurisy, imposthume, etc., he resorts to divers witches. If they know the man and seek to make a difference between the witches and the party, it may be by telling them he hath threatened to have them very shortly searched, and so hanged for witches. Then they all consult with Satan to save themselves, and Satan stands ready prepared, with a "What will you have me do for you, my dear and nearest children?" convenated and compacted with me in my hellish league, and sealed with your blood, my delicate, firebrand darlings. Oh, thou, say they, that at the first didst promise to save us thy servants from any out of deadly enemy's discovery, and didst promise to avenge and flay all of those we pleased that did offend us. Murther, that wretch, suddenly who threatens the downfall of your loyal subjects. He then promiseth to effect it. Next news is heard the party is dead. He comes to the witch, and gets a word of reverence, credence, and respect for his power and activeness, when and indeed that disease kills the party, not the witch, nor the devil. Only the devil knew that such a disease was prominent, and the witch that aggravates her damnation by her familiarity and consent to the devil, and so comes likewise in compass of the laws. This is Satan's usual imposturing and deluding, but not his constant course of proceeding, for he and the witch do mischief too much. But I would that the magistrates and jurors would a little examine witnesses when they hear witches confess such and such a murder, whether the party had not long time before, or at the time when the witch grew suspected, some disease or other predominant, which might cause that issue or effect of death. Question 14. All that the witchfinder doth is to fleece the country of their money, and therefore rides and goes to towns to have employment, and promiseth them their fair promises, and it may be doth nothing for it, and possesseth many men, that they have so many wizards and so many witches in their towns, and so heartens them on to entertain him. Answer. You do him a great deal of wrong in every of these particulars, for first, he never went to any town or place, but they wrote, or sent often for him, and were, for aught he know, glad of him. He is a man that doth disclaim that ever he detected a witch, or said, Thou art a witch, only after her trial by search, and their own confession. He, as others, may judge. Lastly, judge how he fleeceth the country and enriches himself, by considering the vast sum he takes of every town. He demands but 20 per town, and doth sometimes ride 20 miles for that, hath no more than for all his charges thither and back again, and it may stays a week there, and find there 3 or 4 witches, if it be but one, cheap enough, and this is the great sum that he takes to maintain his company with 3 horses. End of the Project Gutenberg source for discovery of the witches. Well, isn't the English language beautiful? I certainly think it is. I would like to thank you for getting this far, and I would like to especially thank my top-tier Patreon subscribers, whatever we call them, patrons, I suppose. Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Susan. Thank you very much. And now that I have read for you the discovery of witches, don't go out and try and find any. You may be a little disappointed. Well, if you do find any, I think these days they're far more interested in selling you crystals and salt lamps and having you subscribe to their TikTok accounts. Witches just ain't what they used to be. Well, thank you very much again for listening. And until next time, I will wish you all the best. Good night, everyone.